Language in India and the ancient linguistic history of the Indian subcontinent is indeed very rich and fascinating. But where did it all sprout from? Where are its origins and how did it come about? India has a long history of linguistic diversity with hundreds of languages and dialects spoken across the country. In ancient times, Sanskrit was the language of not only the elite but even the common folk, and its use was not only limited to religious and literary purposes, or at least for a time. Sanskrit is an Indo-Aryan language, which evolved out of Proto-Indo-Iranian and is a sister language to Avestan. It is part of the broader Indo-European language family. The first speakers of Sanskrit were the Indo-Aryan peoples, who migrated to the Saptasindhu via the Hindu Kush. Sanskrit was first used by the people of the Vedic era in the Saptasindhu and was most notably the language that the sacred four Vedas were composed in. Sanskrit, chanted from the Vedic texts, maintained a tonal system with highs and lows in certain areas of chanting. But this was only limited to chanting and was absent from normal everyday speech. Just a couple centuries after its establishment, Sanskrit spread throughout North India and influenced it culturally through the compositions of the Upanishads and Vedangas, Hindu texts which extended or tried to interpret the Vedas. However, Sanskrit slowly began to go into decline as a language spoken by the common people. As Sanskrit expanded, local vernacular dialects and variants that descended from Sanskrit took over as the common tongue for some centuries. These vernacular variants then became so distant that they evolved into new languages, called the Prakrit languages. More on that later. Sanskrit, however, did not go extinct. An ancient Indian grammarian named Panini composed the Ashtadhyayi, a grammatical treatise that heavily refined Sanskrit. This refined version was known as Classical Sanskrit. Despite the emergence of the Prakrit languages, Sanskrit continued to be the language of the learned and the elite. It remained the language of the religion, philosophy, and literature. The grammar of Sanskrit was meticulously codified, and it became the basis for the grammatical rules of many other Indian languages. So now back to the Prakrit languages. Around 600 to 400 BCE, the Prakrit languages emerged as the vernacular languages of the people. These languages were used in everyday life and were widely spoken across the Indian subcontinent. Prakrit languages are known for their simplicity and flexibility, which made them accessible to a wider range of people. They were used in various fields such as literature, drama, and even commerce. Some of the most notable Prakrit languages include Pali, Ardhamagadhi, and Jain Prakrit. Prakrits were especially promoted when Buddhism and Jainism arose, and Pali became a widespread language in Buddhist teachings. By 200 BCE, the Prakrit languages not only continued to serve as a language for the common folk, but even the elite started to use and speak them. This did not challenge the position of Sanskrit in any way, however. So, how did the Sanskrit Prakrit change occur? What sounds changed? One of the main reasons that the change took place is because Sanskrit is filled with conjoined letters, sounds, and combinations that could be hard to pronounce for the everyday speaker. Vowels like I or au, as well as some endings like aya, ava, or avi, became shortened to just a and o. For example, Maitri became Metta, Sthavira became Thera, Dharayati became Dhareti, and Avatara became Otara. Apart from this, many r sounds became omitted and others were shortened, while elongated a sounds shortened to a. For example, Kshanti became Khanti and Rajya became Rajya. These linguistic changes shaped the Prakrit languages. The most commonly used Prakrits were Pali, used by Buddhists, and Ardhamagadhi, used by Jains, which were growing movements at the time. But each region had their own Prakrit language. For example, Magadha had the Magadhi Prakrit, the Satavahanas had the Maharashtrian Prakrit, and the Central Indians had Shaurasheni Prakrit, etc. Many of these Prakrits made up the linguistic map of ancient India. Although most Prakrit words were directly derived from Sanskrit, the southern Prakrits, like Paisachi and Maharashtrian Prakrit, also borrowed loanwords from Dravidian languages like Telugu and Kannada. In the far south of the Indian subcontinent, Prakrits had not yet been reached, and Tamil was the main spoken tongue. During the Mauryan Empire until the Gupta Empire, these Prakrits, especially Pali, enjoyed patronism and a boost from literature being composed in those languages. In drama, poetry, literature, and even canonical texts, the Prakrit languages were the gold standard of the time. The Prakrit languages continued to be dominant until the 4th and 5th centuries. There was, however, a revival of Sanskrit that came about during this time. You see, from the 4th to the 9th centuries, Buddhism and Jainism gradually started to disappear in India. The Gupta rulers, although also patrons of Prakrit languages, were strict Hindus and also patronized Sanskrit. As a result, Prakrit was gradually replaced with Sanskrit when it came to poetry and literature in the Gupta domain. The languages of India now began diversifying and evolving into a new phase. The post-classical period of Indian linguistic history is defined by the Prakrits evolving into languages called Apabhramsas, which are the predecessors of modern Indian languages. In the south, Telugu, Kannada, and Tamil, Dravidian languages, slowly started to become more dominant than the Indo-Aryan languages, but still borrowed heavily from them. This was also the time when the Pandyas, Cheras, and Cholas were revived back into power after the tenure of the Kalabhra Empire, who were described as oppressors. As a result, the Dravidian languages like Kannada, Tamil, and Telugu started to gain more recognition and became immersed in a golden age of poetry and literature. Especially after the 10th century, a whole new style of southern poetry and literature arose. Back in the north, the Apabhramsas were different from the Prakrits in the sense that the Apabhramsas were more diverse and actually became very distinct from Sanskrit over the centuries, unlike Prakrit, which retained many Sanskrit features and was at least somewhat intelligible to a Sanskrit speaker. From the 6th to the 13th centuries, the Apabhramsas were used in North India by the elite and common folk alike and acted sort of as a cluster of Proto-Hindi languages. One characteristic of some of the Apabhramsas is that the vowel at the end of words would be cut off and stressed letters would just become one letter. For example, the Pali Ratti, meaning night, became the Apabhramsha Rat. From the 10th to the 13th centuries, the Ghaznavid and Ghurid Turks managed to establish themselves in Bactria and Khorasan and then invaded the Indian subcontinent. Not too many years later, the Delhi Sultanate would be established and would become the hegemon of India. The Apabhramsas were still used in poetry and by common people during Muslim rule, but it was here that a certain linguistic fusion occurred. During the 12th and 13th centuries, poets like Amir Khusro composed poetry in a new merged Creole that was a result of the cultural synthesis between the two groups, Hindustani. There was a large influx of Persian and Arabic words into the Indian languages, but also retained many older words. By the 15th century, the Apabhramsas had been incorporated into Hindustani, and most of the common folk in the Ganga Doab and Delhi region spoke it. However, Hindustani was not the only language that emerged. Bengali evolved out of the Abhatta Apabhramsha, taking some Islamic loanwords, but ultimately being directly descended from the Apabhramshas and not a fusion. The same is true for Gujarati, Marwari, and many other languages spoken in the north today. The South, meanwhile, did not borrow much from these languages or go through a similar fusion phase, and so it simply stayed quite constant. Nowadays, Hindustani evolved into Hindi and Urdu, which is spoken widely today. In conclusion, the evolution of the Sanskrit and Prakrit languages into modern day Indian languages has been a long and complex process. The influences of various invaders and cultures have left their marks on the language, resulting in the emergence of new dialects and languages. Despite this, it is evident that these languages still hold onto their roots and continue to evolve while maintaining their unique identities. Understanding the evolution of these languages gives us insight into the rich history and culture of India and allows us to appreciate the diversity and complexity of the languages that are still spoken today. Thank you for watching this episode of Simply History. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more fascinating stories for the past.